All right. Well, happy, beautiful, amazing day. Dr. Bob Rakowski here out of Houston, Texas. One of my great students asked me, Bob, years ago, you summarized some of the effects of sugar and how bad it is. Could you do that again? And of course, you know what? I love sharing great information and things that empower you to better health. So let's take a look at this. When we start looking at sugar and refined carbohydrates, Stanford estimates that the average person ingests over 3,500 pounds of processed sugar in a lifetime. So let's just break this down line by line, step by step. So first and foremost, when you get more sugar than your body can handle, which by the way is not much, in your entire bloodstream, there's estimated to be maybe a teaspoon of sugar floating around. So that's in a full adult. So think about a kid drinking a Coca-Cola, however many grams of sugar in there. I think it's something like 40, but it's probably been decades since I looked at that, but nonetheless, it's way too much. So that's going to elevate your plasma glucose. When it gets above 85, then your body's going to increase the amount of insulin that it releases. Now, in time, here's what we know. Bodies ignore constant stimuli, so the insulin receptors will downregulate. And that, by the way, is what they call insulin resistance. And you know what? There's way too many people that have that, and insulin resistance progressing for too long will ultimately lead to diabetes. The number 7 cause of death here in the US, and by the way, the 6 before that, are all aggravated by insulin resistance or prediabetes. And globally, diabetes is about a $760 billion a year problem. So what happens when people start ingesting this extra sugar? Well, one is they're going to gain weight. And here's one of the sad realities. It's not just going to be subcutaneous fat. That's bad enough, but often it's visceral fat. And that's angry fat, pro-inflammatory fat, dangerous fat. And by the way, with new body composition testing, anybody can get a DEXA scan for about $100. And you can find out how much visceral fat do you have. Now, since this fat increases inflammation, inflammation will actually deplete something called nitric oxide. Nitric oxide dilates blood vessels. And when you don't do that effectively, then you're going to be suffering fatigue because you don't have the oxygen to make the energy. And by the way, the brain is the most energy dependent organ in the body. And I even tell people the most nutrient dependent, energy dependent, stress vulnerable, toxin vulnerable system in the body. And therefore, you can suffer depression. So weight gain, fatigue, depression are this horrible triad, and they tend to feed on one another because when people are depressed, they often tend to self-medicate with sugar, which, by the way, works in the very short term, but then ultimately becomes more damaging in the long run. So taking this path, as we increase glucose, as we increase insulin, one thing that insulin does is it decreases something called sex hormone binding globulin. And men and women alike both have too much estrogen in our body. Then not just the estrogens we make, but there's estrogens in plastics, estrogens in pesticides, estrogens injected into animals. And by the way, as we increase body fat, we increase something called aromatase and convert more testosterone to estrogen. But as our estrogen increases, it increases thyroid hormone binding globulin, and that does just what it says. It binds up thyroid hormone, and that leads to an increased probability of obesity. And by the way, obesity is a major risk factor for everything, but especially early death. So as we increase our carbohydrates, we do that to self-medicate. Cornell found in the late 90s, they actually studied sugar as a non-narcotic analgesic, and they found out it worked. What does that mean? It means it's not a narcotic that'll ease pain. And it does so by changing the brain chemistry, serotonin, beta endorphin they called out, but also dopamine as well. And as we increase these brain chemicals, we have the same response. Bodies ignore constant stimuli. You're going to get down regulation of those brain receptors. That will lead to increased carbohydrate hunger, more carbohydrate ingestion, more obesity, more early death. As we get that insulin resistance, we're going to actually drive the body's own production of cholesterol. So you're going to drive what's known as HMGA co-reductase. That's going to lead to elevated total cholesterol. And then it also drives something called cholesterol ester transfer protein, which is going to decrease HDL, and increased triglycerides. So the pattern of insulin resistance: increased total cholesterol, increased bad cholesterol, decreased good cholesterol, increased triglycerides, and that leads to increased probability of heart attack. And by the way, diabetic patients 6.5x as likely to die from a heart attack. By the way, it also increases the stroke risk as well. So take a little different path. When we have this level of insulin resistance, insulin drives a couple of ovarian enzymes called 17-20-lyase and 17-alpha hydroxylase. That is associated with polycystic ovarian syndrome, which, by the way, is associated with infertility. As we drive our insulin, insulin is actually going to block something called the peroxisome proliferated activated receptor. That's how the body chops down long-chain fatty acids so that you can burn it in the mitochondria. So guess what? You're not going to burn fat as effectively. You're more likely to become obese. Additionally, the increased blood sugar that floats around the body as we become pre-diabetic or diabetic increases the amount of oxidation and inflammation in our body. That will increase heart risk as well as stroke risk, but it's also associated with pain and will deplete nitric oxide, which will lead to fatigue. Insulin causes increased sodium reabsorption from the distal tubules of the kidneys, and that's how you can increase high blood pressure, but it also reduces the body's ability to break down uric acid, and that can lead to an increased probability of gout. So a number of things that happen, by the way, as we begin to become pre-diabetic inflamed, it increases our stress. Our stress is attempt to buffer by cortisol. Cortisol resistance to some degree may exist in the entire population, so it'll actually decrease our ability to tone down the inflammatory process, but cortisol opposes the action of insulin and therefore increases the probability of diabetes. Diabetes is the number one cause of preventable blindness, the number one cause of limb amputation, the number one cause of kidney failure, number one cause of neuropathy, which, by the way, is related to amputation. And then when we start looking at this, what happens when you become pre-diabetic or diabetic? You can have a fatty liver, heart attack, stroke, neuropathy, high blood pressure, dementia. Yeah, they're actually calling Alzheimer's a type 3 diabetes of the brain. Retinopathy, leading to blindness, obesity, inflammation, infertility in both men and women, immune dysfunction, preeclampsia, sexual dysfunction, gout, and or cancer. So bottom line is, friends, don't let friends become diabetic. And why not just even avoid eating all these processed sugars all the time? I was at a conference maybe the late 90s in Southern California. A wonderful endocrinologist named Diana Schwartzbein, she was asked, why do we have so much diabetes? And she said, well, it's 5 against 1. There's 5 hormones that elevate blood sugar: epinephrine, norepinephrine, glucagon, cortisol, and growth hormone, but only one that lowers it, and that would be insulin. But here's what she described as the progression of insulin resistance, which the literature has definitely shown, and I've seen this in clinical practice. The first thing that rises is insulin. First, after eating and then in the fasting state. Second thing that rises is body fat. Insulin says store fat, don't break down fat. Third thing that rises is blood fat, elevated total cholesterol, decreased HDL, increased LDL, increased triglycerides. The last thing that rises is sugar. So the whole point here is sugar is the last thing to rise. So if that's what you're looking at, you're missing it. You want to check insulin levels. You want to look at body fat levels. And you know what? Prevention trumps cure. So anyway, anytime that you can, avoid those simple sugars, those simple carbohydrates, and be healthy, happy, and successful.